Welcome to Alcott's Stories, where love is never simple, pain runs deep, and healing comes wrapped in the most unexpected hearts. Tonight, we bring you a tale of fire and fate, of a quiet man haunted by loss, and a storm woman who walked straight through his grief, and through flames, just to save what mattered most. What happens when a grieving father hires a nanny to care for his children, only to find his broken world slowly stitched back, together by the warmth of her voice, the power of her presence, and one unforgettable night. But love in this story isn't gentle. It's tested, watched, even threatened. Why did a stranger slip Claire's wedding ring into the nanny's purse? Why is someone trying so hard to keep them apart? And when life hangs between fire and forgiveness, will love be enough? You're about to find out. So get comfortable, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to Alcott's Stories for more gripping romance, powerful emotions, and stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Because at Alcott's Stories, love isn't a fairy tale. It's a journey, and yours begins now. Ethan Carter used to command a room with nothing more than his presence, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his tailored shirts clung to a body sculpted by quiet discipline, and eyes so piercing they made people forget their own names. But now he simply existed, like a forgotten frame on a dusty shelf, still beautiful but untouched. After Claire died, time didn't slow. It shattered, leaving fragments of silence scattered across every inch of their home. The house on Maplewood Lane, once alive with laughter, now whispered like a cathedral of grief. Picture frames hung straight yet empty of joy, toys untouched in corners, and Ethan's smile archived like an artifact behind those haunting blue eyes. He wasn't cold, he was numb. His grief wasn't loud, it was the kind that clung to the air like smoke, never seen, always felt. And then she arrived. Zariah Monroe stepped out of a rust-colored taxi that didn't belong on this side of town and looked up at the Carter residence with the calm that came from surviving too many storms. Her presence struck Ethan not like lightning, but like the low rumble of thunder that warns something powerful is near. She had skin kissed by bronze sunlight, a walk that commanded attention without asking for it, and braids that whispered stories with each sway down her back. Zariah didn't belong in anyone's box, not as a nanny, not as a shadow of the past, not as someone expected to heal the unhealable. But her application had been simple. I take care of children like they're my own. I stay where I'm needed, not wanted. Ethan had barely glanced at her resume, yet something in him said yes before logic had the chance to intervene. When she first entered the house, she didn't comment on the grandeur or the grief. She only looked at the children, Lily and Max, and said softly, "Hey, little hearts. I'm Zariah. I'm safe." Lily, who hadn't spoken to a stranger in months, blinked and asked if Zariah knew how to braid doll hair. Max handed her a toy truck like a peace offering. And Ethan? He watched her from the hallway, arms crossed, emotions unreadable, wondering why this stranger made his breath catch. Zariah noticed how Claire's perfume still sat untouched on the vanity, how Ethan never sat at the dinner table, but always hovered, fork in hand, standing by the sink as if eating was a chore, not nourishment. He wasn't mean but distant, like a man guarding a door to a room no one was allowed to enter. Zariah had known grief, not the kind written in obituaries, but the kind woven into the skin. Her mother worked 3 jobs and never hugged her. Her father was a blank line on her birth certificate. She once wanted to be a writer, but dreams didn't pay rent in a world that didn't wait for brown girls with big ideas. Now she was here not to chase love, but to escape from needing it. Ethan rarely spoke to her beyond the logistics of parenting, yet she noticed he never corrected her when she hummed while cooking, and sometimes lingered in the kitchen doorway like he was listening for something he'd forgotten. One evening, as the children played outside, Zariah stood barefoot in the garden, pulling weeds with hands that knew hard work. Ethan watched through the window, transfixed. Something about the way her body moved, graceful but grounded, curved like poetry, stirred a feeling he thought had died with Claire. When their eyes met through the glass, He looked away, ashamed of the flicker in his chest. Zariah noticed. She noticed everything. The way the children still called for their mother in their sleep. The unopened anniversary card on the mantel. The way Ethan touched the piano but never played. And Ethan, for all his restraint, couldn't ignore the way Zariah filled the house, not with noise but with breath. She never tried to replace Claire. And maybe that's why the house didn't fight her presence. She moved like she belonged, even when no one said she did. One night, Ethan found her reading in the living room after the kids were in bed. Her voice soft, her legs curled beneath her. He asked if she was comfortable. "Comfort's a privilege," she replied, not unkindly. He paused, nodded, and sat in silence across from her. That silence was different. Not hollow, not heavy, just paused, like something waiting to be spoken. Zariah caught him watching her sometimes, not with desire, not yet, but with curiosity. Like he was trying to figure out what it meant to feel again. She kept her distance. She knew men who were broken. Some shattered things when they were hurt. Others, like Ethan, simply faded. But one thing was certain, something was changing slowly, quietly, in the spaces between grief and healing, and neither of them was ready to name it. Zariah Monroe didn't enter the Carter household like a disruption, but like morning sunlight creeping through forgotten. Curtains, not loud, not demanding, but impossible to ignore once it touched you. She moved with a kind of reverence, as though she could feel the history pulsing beneath every floorboard, the ghosts breathing through the wallpaper, the quiet sorrow humming behind the silence. The children responded to her, not because she entertained them, but because she saw them, not as fragments of a broken family, but as whole beings still capable of joy. Lily began asking to sit in Zariah's lap during story time, leaning into her warmth like a vine desperate for light. Max, who rarely smiled since Claire's funeral, began giggling during bubble baths again, especially when Zariah pretended the soap suds were monster beards. Ethan watched these moments from the periphery, half grateful and half guarded, like a man standing outside his own life. Zariah didn't press him, but she noticed. She noticed how he ran his thumb over the rim of his coffee, cup longer than necessary. How he sometimes put food on his plate and then left the table before taking a bite. She saw the subtle winces when Lily mentioned her mother, the way his jaw clenched when Max asked if heaven had phones. There was one night in particular, late, long after bedtime, when she found him standing outside the children's rooms, barefoot, holding an old baby monitor that hadn't been used in years, as if hoping to hear Claire's voice through the static. Zariah didn't interrupt. She just passed by, their eyes meeting in a hallway thick with invisible grief, and offered a silent nod that said, "I see you, even if you wish I didn't." What Ethan feared most wasn't forgetting Claire. It was remembering her so vividly it hurt to breathe. He'd built a shrine out of habits, the untouched side of the bed, the perfume bottle gathering dust, the closet full of her clothes still pressed and scented with time. Zariah never invaded those spaces, but she could feel them pulsing, alive with memory and untouchable reverence. She didn't walk on eggshells. She walked like someone who respected the cracks in the floor. One afternoon, while cleaning, she discovered a drawer full of Claire's unfinished journals. She didn't open them. She simply placed them on the shelf, carefully, as if returning someone's prayers. That night, Ethan quietly entered the kitchen and poured himself a glass of bourbon he rarely touched anymore. "Do you think people can haunt themselves?" he asked without looking at her. Zariah, folding Lily's socks, replied softly, "Only when they keep the door open long enough." His eyes flicked toward hers, sharp, surprised, maybe even challenged, but he didn't respond. Instead, he left the glass on the counter untouched. Zariah lay awake that night thinking about ghosts, not the ones who creaked in floorboards, but the ones who lived in regrets, in what-ifs, in the things people never said out loud. Ethan was haunted, but not by Claire. He was haunted by the man he no longer recognized. And Zariah, though uninvited, was slowly becoming a mirror he couldn't look away from. He began noticing things about her, too, not just her presence, but the texture of her silence, the way she paused before answering certain questions, the shadow that occasionally crossed her face when Max called her Mama by accident. He apologized once, flustered and red-faced. She'd smiled gently and said he just misses softness. It undid something in him. Days passed. Seasons began to shift. And though Ethan still maintained his distance, there were cracks now, hairline fractures in the walls. He'd built so high and so thick, even his children couldn't climb over them. One evening, while walking past the living room, he caught her dancing with Lily, barefoot, twirling to an old jazz song playing from her phone. The moment was pure, unsanitized, and something inside him, buried so long beneath grief and guilt, dared to stir. Zariah didn't try to take up space, but she did. She filled the house with new smells, cinnamon, cocoa butter, honeyed tea, with music that didn't beg to be heard but changed the mood of a room when it played. With a voice that read stories in accents, sang lullabies in half-whispers, and occasionally hummed unfamiliar melodies that didn't sound like mourning. They sounded like rebuilding. Still, Ethan resisted, because hope felt like betrayal, because smiling felt disloyal, because somewhere deep inside, he was afraid that if he allowed himself to feel again, Claire's memory would disappear completely. But Zariah wasn't asking him to forget. She was reminding him that memories don't die, they evolve. That love doesn't end, it just changes shape. And maybe, just maybe, she was becoming part of that change. The sky split open that night, as if it, too, had something to grieve, thunder growling low and heavy, rain drumming against the windows like fists on a locked door, and wind that howled through the trees as though mourning its own memories. Power blinked once and vanished, taking with it the soft hum of the refrigerator, the nightlights in the hall, and the thin veil of normalcy that held the Carter home together. The house fell into a quiet so thick it throbbed. Zariah lit candles with careful hands, shielding the flames from drafts as she guided Lily and Max through their bedtime rituals by flickering light. Max clung to her neck, whispering, "Don't go," as she laid him down. Lily refused to close her eyes unless Zariah promised to stay until the storm passed. So she did, sat between their beds, humming low and steady, a soundless prayer more than a lullaby, until their breath softened into sleep. By the time she stood up, her back ached, her mind fogged by exhaustion, and the storm had gotten worse, rain smashing against the windows, thunder so loud it rattled picture frames. Disoriented, half in a trance, she climbed the staircase, shadows stretching long across the walls, and found herself in a hallway she usually avoided after dark. She turned the doorknob with a familiarity that wasn't hers, stepping into a room scented faintly with old cologne and the ghost of lavender. She didn't realize it wasn't hers, not until the door clicked shut behind her, and she was already inside Ethan Carter's room. The sheets were pulled slightly back, his silhouette resting deep in the mattress, breath slow, body curled inward like something once fierce, made small by grief. She didn't mean to stay, just to sit, to catch her breath, to gather her bearings in a night that felt too raw, too alive. But then Ethan stirred, his lips parted, voice rough with sleep and memory, murmuring a name that pulled the air from the room. Claire. A beat, a pause so thick it felt like eternity holding its breath. Then his brows furrowed, confusion replacing familiarity. He didn't open his eyes, just reached out blindly in the dark, fingertips brushing the edge of her arm, voice breaking, not from lust but from ache. "Don't leave." The words weren't a plea for romance. They were a call across a chasm. Zariah stood frozen, lightning flashing through the curtains, illuminating the sharp lines of his jaw, the silver glint at his temple, the fragile weight of his vulnerability. She could have corrected him, backed out quietly, explained herself. But she didn't, because something in that moment, primal, broken wholly, begged not to be undone. So she sat down on the edge of the bed. She didn't touch him, didn't speak, just listened to his breath, to the rain, to the echoes of loss reverberating between them. And slowly he shifted, instinctively leaning into her presence. Like a man seeking warmth in the middle of winter, she lay beside him, fully clothed, heart pounding, not with desire, but with the weight of being needed. Really needed by someone who didn't even know what they were asking for. Ethan didn't speak again, His hand brushed hers beneath the sheets, not to grasp, but to ground himself. And Zariah, though her body remained still, felt everything inside her stir, not passion, not yet, but something more frightening, recognition, because she, too, had nights when she reached into the dark for voices that never came back. She, too, had asked someone not to leave and been answered by silence. They lay like that for hours, strangers by definition, but connected now by an intimacy deeper than skin. The storm outside wailed and wept, but in that room there was only breath and heartbeats, and the fragile silence that lives between two people who don't know what to call what's happening to them. When dawn finally came, grey and trembling at the edges, Zariah slipped out of the bed without waking him, leaving behind only the scent of cocoa butter and quiet understanding. Ethan would remember none of it clearly, but he would remember the feeling that on the worst night of the season, when the world outside was chaos, someone had stayed, not because they had to, but because they understood what it meant to be haunted and still choose to stay. Morning arrived like a hesitant confession, all grey light and damp air, the storm having left behind puddles on the sidewalks and something heavier inside the Carter house, something unnamed but undeniable. Zariah stood at the stove, flipping pancakes for the children, the scent of cinnamon floating through the kitchen, her smile soft but distracted. Ethan entered without a word, hair still damp from a shower, movements precise but less guarded, as if last night had loosened something tightly wound. They didn't speak of it, the storm, the shared bed, the unspoken warmth, but it lingered like steam in the air, clinging to every glance and gesture. When she handed him his coffee, his fingers brushed hers for a second longer than needed, and neither of them moved away. Max didn't notice. Lily giggled as she chewed, but Ethan's eyes remained on Zariah, studying the curve of her shoulders, the gentle way she smoothed Lily's braids, the rhythm of her breath. And Zariah, though composed, felt it, the shift, how the silence between them had changed from avoidance to awareness. Every glance had weight now. Every step near him was edged with magnetism. Her heart beat differently when he entered the room, and she caught herself wondering what might have happened if the storm had lasted one more night. Ethan seemed more awake than usual, present in a way he hadn't been in months, and his gaze followed her now, not in hunger, but in longing. It was in the way he lingered at the doorway when she read to the kids, in the way his eyes softened, when she sang lullabies in a language he didn't understand, in the quiet murmur of her name when he thought she wasn't listening. But Zariah had learned long ago that joy was never just joy, not for women like her. That closeness could be a gift or a warning. That love, when not spoken aloud, could still become a target. So when the envelope arrived, slipped through the mail slot without sound, its stark whiteness against the hardwood floor was more chilling than any thunderstorm. No return address, no postage mark, just one sentence in black ink, written with precision. And venom, a nanny doesn't belong in a dead woman's bed. Zariah stared at it, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, fingers trembling slightly as she read it again and again. A coldness spread inside her, not from fear, but from recognition. She'd dealt with this kind of thing before, not exactly like this, but close enough, the invisible reminders that she was never fully welcome in certain spaces, especially not the sacred ones left behind by White, dead women with pictures still on the walls. Ethan found her in the kitchen, standing frozen, the letter on the counter between them, like a bomb waiting to go off. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice suddenly too loud in the quiet. She didn't answer at first, just slid the letter across the granite. His jaw tightened. His eyes scanned the words and then met hers, dark with disbelief and something hotter, fury maybe. Who would? He started, then stopped, the sentence unfinished because he already knew. The neighborhood had watched him mourn, watched him hire her, watched the color of her skin and the shape of her hips, and the way the children clung to her. They saw what he refused to admit, that something had shifted, that lines had blurred, that the Carter house wasn't sealed in grief anymore. It was warming, and not everyone welcomed the thaw. Zariah stepped back, crossing her arms over her chest like armor. "I'm not trying to take her place," she said quietly, voice steadier than she felt. "I never was." Ethan's voice cracked. "I know that." But knowing didn't erase the truth, that someone out there had been watching closely enough to see what even they hadn't fully named yet. The letter was more than a warning. It was a reminder. The world was still cruel, still watching, still full of people who measured worth in shadows. Ethan took a step toward her, but she didn't move. This changes things," she whispered. He shook his head, desperate. "It doesn't have to." But it already had. The warmth between them was now laced with danger, with scrutiny, with choices that would either shatter everything or change it forever. Zariah walked out of the room before she could cry. Ethan remained behind, staring at the letter as if it were a weapon, and wondering if the ghost of Claire had really died, or if her absence had simply made room for another haunting. Zariah never thought the past would find her here, in a quiet suburban home, where she'd tried to bury it deep, beneath layers of responsibility and new beginnings. But the past has a way of blowing in like a cold wind, unexpected and ruthless, shattering the fragile peace she'd started to build. It was late afternoon when Deshawn appeared at the doorstep, the man who once held her heart in his hands, only to crush it without mercy. His skin was a shade darker than hers, his gaze sharp and calculating, and his voice carried the weight of old promises broken and new demands made. "I want you back," he said, standing tall in the doorway, arms crossed like a judge ready to sentence. "This life ain't yours." Zariah's breath caught, heart pounding as memories surged, nights filled with harsh words, fists that never landed but bruised her spirit anyway, and a love that had twisted into chains she'd spent years breaking free from. She closed the door gently but didn't slam it. There was still a part of her, tangled in the shadows of that man, a part that questioned whether running had been enough. Ethan, who had been coming home early that day, saw the confrontation from the living room window, his jaw clenched, muscles tightening beneath his shirt, the usual calm blue in his eyes flickering with something sharper. Rage. Not just for Zariah, but for the man who dared to challenge what she was trying to build here. That evening, the house was thick with tension, the silence between them heavier than any storm. Ethan found Zariah sitting at the kitchen table, eyes distant, fingers tracing the rim of a glass of water. He sat across from her, voice low but steady. "Is he what you want?" The question wasn't a challenge or an accusation, it was a plea for truth. Zariah swallowed hard, the weight of that moment pressing down like a stone on her chest. She didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't simple, because she had spent so long convincing herself that the past was dead and buried, only to realize that some ghosts refused to stay silent, because she wasn't sure if what she wanted was safety, love, freedom, or simply peace, whatever that meant. Ethan watched her struggle, saw the flicker of pain and doubt cross her face, and felt a sudden urge to protect her from all the battles she had yet to fight. But he also knew this was hers, this reckoning with the man who had once tried to define her. Break her and claim her. They sat there, two broken people trying to piece themselves together in the same fragile space, the past looming over them like a storm cloud threatening to break. Zariah finally whispered, "I don't know yet." The words hung in the air, honest and raw, a confession that she was as lost as he was hopeful. And in that moment, something shifted, the beginning of a new kind of trust, fragile but real, between a man haunted by loss and a woman haunted by her own past. Neither of them had answers, but both understood the courage it took just to ask the questions. The fragile thread holding Ethan and Zariah together snapped suddenly, violently in the sterile, cold chaos of the hospital emergency room. Max, usually bright-eyed and bursting with energy, had collapsed during dinner, a high fever burning through his small body, his breath shallow and ragged. And the fear in Ethan's eyes was a raw, exposed thing that Zariah had never seen before. The ambulance ride had been a blur of sirens and frantic voices, but now, sitting in the bleak waiting room with the harsh, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, reality hit hard. Zariah's carefully maintained composure crumbled as tears spilled down her cheeks, silent prayers trembling from her lips in a language only she understood, a desperate plea to gods she wasn't sure believed in. Ethan, seeing her unravel, didn't pull back. Instead, he crossed the distance between them and wrapped her in his arms, holding her not like a supervisor or caretaker, but like a man who had already fallen, completely and irrevocably, into something deeper than pain or grief. His hands shook slightly as they cradled her, the strength beneath the tremble telling her everything she didn't need, spoken aloud, that he was scared, that he was human, that he needed her as much as she needed him. The minutes stretched endlessly, each one a lifetime, until finally a nurse emerged, her face a mask of professionalism and relief. Max was stable, just a bad virus. Relief crashed over them in waves, but it left behind a new kind of rawness, an exposure neither of them had expected. Standing together in the long, quiet hospital corridor, the sterile walls echoing the pounding of their hearts, Ethan looked at Zariah with an intensity that stopped her breath. "You terrify me, Zariah," he said, voice low and shaking with a mix of fear and awe, "because I've never wanted anything since Claire. And now I want everything with you." Those words were a confession, a surrender, a declaration wrapped in vulnerability. They held the weight of a man who had believed his heart was frozen forever, and a woman who had learned to guard hers with steel. In that moment, love wasn't gentle. It was fierce, jagged, and terrifyingly real. It was the kind of love that demanded courage, that challenged every scar, every fear, every doubt that had shaped them. And as Zariah looked up into Ethan's storm-blue eyes, she felt the wall she'd built around herself begin to crumble. Not because she was weak, but because she had found something worth breaking for. Max's small hand wrapped around her finger, grounding her in the present, reminding her that this fragile family was worth every risk, every fight, every heartbeat. In the sterile quiet of the hospital, surrounded by the echoes of pain and hope, two souls battered by life's storms took a step forward, not toward perfection, but toward a love that was honest, fierce, and above all real. Zariah had always known that stepping into the Carter household meant stepping into a world etched with loss, but nothing had prepared her for the cold weight of Claire's wedding ring tucked deep. Inside her purse, a silent, invisible warning that she was being watched, judged, marked. The ring was like a ghost of the past, heavy with memory and accusation, a relic that whispered, "You don't belong here." She felt the atmosphere shift instantly, a tightening in her chest, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And then Vivian arrived, Claire's sister, a woman whose bitterness had simmered just beneath polite smiles, whose presence had always been a silent storm in the family's calm waters. Vivian's eyes locked onto Zariah the moment she stepped in, sharp and cold as broken glass, full of a disdain that went beyond personal dislike. It was a rejection of everything Zariah represented. "You think you can take her place?" Vivian hissed one afternoon, her words slicing through the quiet like a blade. "You think a black woman belongs in this family?" The venom in her voice was as old as prejudice itself, a toxic reminder of boundaries drawn not by love, but by fear and hate. Zariah's skin prickled with the weight of those words, the sting of history and hate, colliding in a single moment that threatened to unravel everything she had fought for. But Vivian's attacks didn't end there. The threat grew darker, sharper, legal custody battles, whispered rumors, the possibility that Ethan might be forced to choose between his children and the woman who had become their anchor. The past, with its unyielding claws, crashed down on them, demanding allegiance to old loyalties and threatening to tear apart the fragile family they were trying to build. Ethan, usually composed and reserved, found himself caught in the crossfire, pressured by family, society, and a system that seemed eager to punish love, that dared to cross invisible lines. The choice he faced was cruel and impossible: maintain public silence, protect a reputation, and sacrifice the truth of his heart, or stand for what he knew was right and risk losing everything he had left. And in that moment, something in Ethan shifted. The grief that had shadowed his every step since, Claire's death was met now by a fierce resolve, a fire kindled by love and the need to protect his children and Zariah. He refused to be broken by fear or tradition. With a strength born of desperation and hope, Ethan made a decision that shocked even those closest to him. He resigned from his prestigious job, selling the shares in the company that had once symbolized his success and stability, and took full legal guardianship of Lily and Max. A bold and costly move that declared without words where his loyalty truly lay. The courtroom battles that followed were fierce and unrelenting. Vivian's lawyers wielded every tactic to paint Zariah as an outsider, a threat, someone who could never replace Claire. Rumors and gossips swirled around the Carter name like a storm, but Ethan stood unwavering. In the face of prejudice and pain, he became a fortress for his family, unyielding, protective, and unafraid to fight for the love that gave his life meaning again. Through it all, Zariah remained his steadfast companion, her courage and resilience shining in the darkest moments, reminding him that love was not just about passion, but about survival and defiance. Together, they faced the harsh judgment of a world that was not ready to accept them. But each challenge only strengthened, the bond growing quietly between them. A bond forged in shared pain, mutual respect, and the unbreakable desire to protect their family. And as the dust settled from the battles, as the echoes of threats and whispers faded, Ethan and Zariah found themselves standing in a home, transformed, no longer a mausoleum of grief, but a sanctuary of hope. In the quiet moments, as they shared a look that spoke of everything they'd endured and everything they still dreamed of, Ethan smiled for the first time in a long time, a smile full of promise, resilience, and the unshakable truth that love, no matter how tested, could rebuild what had been broken. The future was uncertain, the path ahead rugged and fraught with challenges, but they were no longer alone or afraid. They were a family, imperfect, scarred, and fiercely united, ready to face whatever came next together. Weeks had passed since the storm of legal battles, and whispered threats had shaken the fragile peace. Ethan and Zariah fought to hold on to, yet nothing could have prepared them for the sudden terror that exploded like wildfire one ordinary afternoon. The house, their sanctuary, their refuge, held secrets in its creaky bones and aging walls, secrets like faulty wiring that no one had noticed or fixed, waiting silently to ignite. Lily, with her boundless curiosity and bright spirit, wandered off, slipping quietly away from the safety of the main rooms. The garage, usually a place of clutter and shadowed corners, had become a trap without warning. A faint spark, barely audible over the hum of the afternoon, exploded into a fierce crackle, and before anyone could react, flames erupted, hungry, violent, a roaring inferno devouring the air and filling the house with smoke thick and suffocating. The suddenness of it shattered the calm like glass breaking, a storm of heat and fear that drew Zariah instantly. Her instincts kicked in with terrifying clarity. She heard Lily's frightened cries, piercing and raw, cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. Without hesitation, without a moment to weigh the danger or call for help, she plunged into the smoke and flame, every step a battle against the scorching heat that threatened to consume her. Ethan's voice cut through the chaos, desperate and ragged. "Zariah, no!" "Don't!" But she was already gone, swallowed by the fire that danced like a beast hungry for destruction. In those terrifying moments, time stretched and twisted. The air was thick with ash, the world reduced to crackling fire and choking smoke. Then, suddenly, she emerged, coughing, gasping, the acrid smoke burning her lungs, blood staining her lips, but holding something precious and fragile in her arms. Lily, alive, trembling, eyes wide with shock but safe. The relief that surged through Ethan was almost unbearable, but it was quickly replaced by fresh horror as Zariah collapsed, her body finally giving out under the weight of smoke inhalation and burns. The sirens blared, paramedics rushed, the world spinning in a blur of panic and pain. The next 3 days in the ICU were a fragile limbo, suspended between hope and fear. Ethan stayed by her side, unblinking, unmoving, a silent sentinel in the sterile, cold hospital room filled with beeping monitors and soft whispers. His hand never left hers, squeezing gently, grounding her when the pain threatened to overwhelm. The image of Zariah, so fierce moments before, now so fragile and pale, carved itself into his heart. When she finally opened her eyes, it was as if the entire world held its breath. Ethan's voice broke as he spoke, raw with emotion and awe. "You walked through fire for them. For me," the words hung between them, heavy with everything they had endured and everything they still feared to face. "I'm done running," he confessed, tears glistening in the corners of his eyes. "Marry me." The proposal wasn't just a promise of forever. It was a declaration of surrender. Surrender to the love they'd both tried to deny. A willingness to fight for what mattered most. Zariah, weak but fiercely alive, looked up into his storm-blue eyes, eyes that had weathered loss, pain, and loneliness, and saw reflected there the same desperate hope that had carried her through every scar. In that stark hospital room, surrounded by the fragile hum of machines and the soft pulse of life, two wounded souls found strength in each other. Their love, like the fire they had walked through, was fierce, consuming, and transformative. It burned away the fear, the doubt, and the past, leaving behind only the fierce promise of a future rebuilt together. As Ethan held her hand, as their fingers intertwined in a quiet, unbreakable bond, they both knew that from this moment on, they would face every storm, every trial, every shadow, not alone but as one. Love wasn't gentle or easy, but it was theirs, and it was everything.